On a sweltering afternoon in July 2019, the crew of a massive British oil tanker called the Stena Impero was navigating a narrow strip of water in the Middle East. Suddenly, the ship's radio crackled with military warnings. Within minutes, heavily armed commandos in black ski masks rappelled out of military helicopters directly onto the deck of the moving vessel, while fast attack speedboats swarmed the hull below. The tanker was hijacked in broad daylight. Within hours of the incident hitting the news, the entire global economy twitched. Stock markets braced for impact, global oil prices spiked, world leaders rushed into emergency meetings, and navies went on high alert. Why? Because this didn't happen in the middle of the vast, open ocean. It happened in a specific 21-mile gap of water. A gap that, if closed for even a few days, would cause the modern world to run out of the energy it needs to function. This is the Strait of Hormuz. You clicked on this video to find out how a single strip of water controls the modern world, and that commando raid is exactly what it looks like when that control is threatened. But to truly understand the terrifying power of this maritime chokepoint, you have to completely forget about oil, helicopters, and modern military standoffs. You have to go back to a time when this exact same stretch of water was nothing more than a quiet neighborhood crossing. A place where an ancient fisherman in a wooden boat crossed the sea, not to control the global economy, but just to buy groceries. Millions of years ago, long before humans walked the earth, the shifting of tectonic plates initiated a slow-motion geographical collision. The massive Arabian plate slammed into the Eurasian plate. The sheer force of this planetary impact buckled the Earth's crust, pushing the towering Zagros Mountains up into the sky in modern-day Iran, and violently shattering the limestone Earth at the northern tip of Oman. Geologists refer to the resulting landscape on the Omani side, the Musandam Peninsula, as a drowned landscape. It is a place of severe, jagged beauty. Massive, razor-sharp mountains plunge vertically into deep ocean waters, creating a maze of coastal fjords. Because this terrain was so impossibly rugged, traveling across land was virtually impossible. There was no flat ground to farm, no plains to ride horses across, and no valleys to build wide roads. So, the first humans who settled here thousands of years ago had only one option. They looked to the water. For the indigenous people of this region, particularly cliff-dwelling tribes like the Shihu, this narrow waterway was not a barrier, it was a bridge. Cut off from the rest of the Arabian Peninsula by the impassable mountains behind them, their entire existence relied on the sea. They built distinct wooden boats called dhows. These ships were not held together by iron nails, which would rust in the salt water, but were painstakingly stitched together using rope made from coconut husks. And because the water was so narrow at this specific bottleneck, just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point, these early sailors could stand on their shores on a clear day and physically see the mountains of Iran rising on the opposite horizon. 21 miles is shorter than a modern marathon. For these ancient coastal dwellers, crossing to another continent was just a morning commute. For centuries, local men would load their stitched wooden dhows with dried fish, salt, and dates, catch the morning winds, and make the crossing. They were going grocery shopping. They arrived in Persian markets, traded their goods for fresh produce, woven textiles, and pottery, and sailed back home before nightfall. Because of this constant interaction, a completely unique microculture was born. The isolated cliff dwellers developed a language, Kumzari, which is a hyperlocal blend of Arabic and Persian. There were no borders here, no customs agents, no tariffs, and no naval blockades. It was a quiet, intimate, borderless world shared by fishermen and localized traders. But geography this perfect never stays quiet for long. As the earliest human civilizations began to form and expand, they quickly realized that this narrow gap was the only connection between two massive bodies of water, the Persian Gulf and the open Indian Ocean. Right around 3000 BC, the Strait of Hormuz stopped being a local grocery route and transformed into the first international highway of the ancient world. In ancient Mesopotamia, located in modern-day Iraq, the world's first great empires were rising. The Sumerians were building massive ziggurats, inventing writing and establishing complex legal codes. But the Sumerians had a catastrophic geographic problem. They had brilliant engineers, highly fertile soil between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and abundant clay for building. But they had absolutely no metal. To build weapons, to forge tools, and to transition human history from the Stone Age into the Bronze Age, the Mesopotamians desperately needed copper. And the closest, most abundant source of copper was located in the rugged mountains of Magan, which we know today as Oman. To get that copper to the Sumerian kings, ancient merchants had to load heavy cargo ships, navigate up the coast of Oman, turn the geographic corner, and pass directly through the Strait of Hormuz to enter the Persian Gulf. Suddenly, this quiet crossing was facilitating the literal advancement of human civilization. The local fishermen watching from the cliffs were no longer just seeing their neighbors' grocery boats. They were watching the heavy, vital supply chain of the ancient world floating right past their front doors. The strait had become a lifeline. If you think controlling the Strait of Hormuz is a strictly modern obsession born out of the petroleum industry, this is where history takes a sharp, dramatic turn. Long before the United States, Britain, or modern Iran stationed massive warships in these waters, the strait was dominated by a legendary, fabulously wealthy empire that most people today have entirely forgotten. It was an empire that realized a fundamental, terrifying truth about the world. If you can put a toll booth on a geographical choke point, you can tax the entire planet. By the Middle Ages, global trade had exploded. The ships passing through the strait were no longer just carrying raw copper. They were carrying the most precious commodities on earth: silk from China, spices from India, and flawless pearls harvested from the shallow waters of the Persian Gulf. All of it had to pass through this narrow 21-mile throat to reach the lucrative markets of the Middle East and Europe. Sitting right in the middle of this throat, waiting for them, was the Kingdom of Hormuz. Originally, Hormuz was a wealthy settlement on the mainland of Iran. But in the 13th century, to escape the devastating raids of Mongol armies sweeping across Asia, the rulers of Hormuz made a radical decision. They moved their entire city, their entire civilization, off the mainland and onto a barren, hostile island right in the middle of the strait. This island was essentially a massive dome of salt baking under the relentless Middle Eastern sun. It had absolutely no fresh water. It had no arable soil to grow crops. The earth was rich in iron oxide, but entirely dead for agriculture. It was quite literally a rock in the ocean, but it had the ultimate geopolitical weapon: location. Because of where this salt island was positioned, every single merchant ship that wanted to enter or exit the Persian Gulf was forced to stop at Hormuz and pay a heavy tax. In exchange, the kingdom offered safe harbor, a massive global marketplace, and protection from pirates. The wealth generated by this single geographical choke point was staggering. When the Venetian explorer Marco Polo visited Hormuz, he was rendered almost speechless by the sheer scale of luxury. He documented a city overflowing with war elephants, mountains of precious stones, gold woven into tapestries, and spices piled high in the markets. The residents of Hormuz became unimaginably wealthy. They built spectacular palaces out of white stone and coral, using towering wind catchers to cool their homes in the summer heat. They didn't need to farm, and they didn't need fresh water springs. They just bought their water. Every single day, armadas of small boats shipped fresh drinking water over from the mainland, entirely paid for by the endless river of tax money flowing through their ports. For hundreds of years, the Kingdom of Hormuz proved a universal law that still governs our world today. Whoever controls the bottleneck controls the wealth, but massive wealth always attracts predators. At the dawn of the 16th century, the predators arrived, and they came from the other side of the planet. In 1507, the horizon off the coast of Hormuz darkened with the sails of heavily armed Portuguese galleons, commanded by a ruthless military visionary named Afonso de Albuquerque. Albuquerque understood that Portugal did not have the manpower to conquer massive inland territories in Asia or the Middle East. But he realized that if Portugal could simply capture the maritime choke points of the world, they could completely monopolize global trade. When Albuquerque looked at the Strait of Hormuz, he didn't see a peaceful trading hub, he saw a valve. And he wanted to own the handle. The Portuguese fleet sailed into the strait and unleashed a devastating barrage of heavy cannon fire on the Kingdom of Hormuz. The local defenders, whose ships were still largely traditional wooden dhows, were entirely unprepared for European artillery. The destruction was swift and absolute. The Portuguese captured the island and immediately began building a massive stone fortress, a concrete manifestation of their absolute control over the strait. This fortress, which still stands today, was not just a defensive structure, it was a psychological one. It was a clear, unmistakable message to every merchant ship in the Indian Ocean. Portuguese power, not local autonomy, now governed the flow of trade. This shift was the first true globalization of the strait's importance. The Portuguese didn't just tax the flow of goods, they actively diverted them. By controlling Hormuz, they had the power to dictate which ships could carry spices to which European markets, effectively creating the first maritime monopoly. They replaced the loose, market-driven trade of the ancient era with a rigid, militarized trade network. This was the moment the strait truly became a choke point in the modern sense, a point where the flow of the entire world's commerce could be stopped, redirected, or crippled by a single military force. The Portuguese era lasted for over a century, until it was challenged by other rising European powers, notably the Dutch and the British, who saw the same value in that narrow stretch of water. The strategic importance of the strait became a primary driver of European conflict in the region, turning a local maritime route into a theater for imperial competition. Today, the actors have changed, and the commodity has shifted from spices to petroleum, but the core economic principle remains untouched. When we look at the Strait of Hormuz now, with its modern navies, its sophisticated radar systems, and its global stakes, we are not looking at something fundamentally new. This narrow strip of water has been the stage upon which humanity has repeatedly tested the limits of power, control, and economic ambition. The commando raid on the Strait of Hormuz was just the latest chapter. Every military buildup, every threat to close the strait, and every naval maneuver in these waters is an echo of the same ancient realization: the world's most valuable things have to pass through here. Maybe the real lesson of the strait isn't about oil, or even about trade. Maybe the real lesson is that in a world that is supposedly interconnected, our entire global civilization, our prosperity, our technology, our daily lives, is still precariously balanced on a few small, narrow geographical gaps. We live in an era where we believe that we have conquered geography. We fly through the air, we send data through undersea cables, and we move goods at lightning speed. But whenever you trace those connections back to their source, you always find a bottleneck. And at the end of the day, those bottlenecks are the places where the real power of the world is decided. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a place on a map. It is the ultimate measure of our global fragility. And as long as the world runs on the energy that flows through that 21-mile throat, the story of Hormuz will continue to be the story of us all.